In 1934, more than 90% of American farms had no electricity, no refrigerator humming in the corner, no electric range. And yet families raised 8, 10, 12 children and put 3 meals on the table every single day. How? Tricks. Tricks so clever that when the grid went dark during the Dust Bowl and the Depression, these families barely blinked. Number 14 on this list kept eggs fresh for 8 months without a fridge, and food scientists say it still works. And number 3 creates a chemical reaction your modern kitchens simply cannot duplicate. These skills fed a nation through its hardest years, then vanished the moment the lights came on. Before we count down, hit that subscribe button because the next blackout is always coming. And this knowledge might be the difference between hungry and fed. Let's begin with number 25. Number 25, the bacon grease can. On every wood stove in America sat a coffee tin, its lid long gone, half full of golden fat. After frying the morning bacon, your great-grandmother poured that hot grease through a scrap of cheesecloth to catch the burnt bits and set it back by the warm stove where it kept for weeks without spoiling. That fat did everything. It fried the eggs, greased the cornbread pan, browned the potatoes, and got spread on bread with a shake of salt when times were lean. A pound of bacon cost around 25 cents in 1935, so throwing away the drippings was unthinkable. The saturated fat kept solid and stable at room temperature, no refrigeration required. When electric refrigerators and vegetable shortening took over kitchens in the 1950s, that humble can disappeared. But nothing you buy in a plastic tub browns a potato the way that can did. Number 24, the hay box cooker. Before slow cookers, before propane, families cooked a pot of beans while they were out working the fields, using nothing but trapped heat. Your great-grandmother would bring a pot of beans and water to a hard boil for 10 minutes, then bury it inside a wooden crate packed tight with hay, wool, or crumpled newspaper and clamp the lid down. The insulation held the heat for 6 or 7 hours, finishing the beans slowly with zero fuel. No wood to chop, no fire to tend, no danger of burning. A crate cost nothing, and a bale of hay a few cents. This was called a fireless cooker, and the government actually promoted them during World War I to save fuel. Modern insulated cookers sell for $80 and do exactly what a box of hay did for free. Number 23, the salt pork barrel. When a family butchered a hog in November, there was no freezer to hold 500 pounds of meat, so they reached for salt. Fatty cuts were packed in a wooden barrel between thick layers of coarse salt, which drew the moisture out and made the meat impossible for bacteria to touch. That barrel sat in the cellar and fed the family clear through to spring. A slab of salt pork simmered with beans or fried with cornmeal stretched a single hog across an entire winter. Salt cost pennies a pound, and the method was thousands of years old. Before eating, you soaked the meat overnight to draw the salt back out. When refrigeration arrived, the barrel went to the barn to hold nails. But salt pork asked for no electricity and never once let a family down through a long, dark January. Number 22, root cellar layering. 6 feet under the ground, the temperature holds steady near 50 degrees all year, and rural families turn that fact into a refrigerator that never needed power. But the real trick was the layering. Your great-grandmother buried her carrots and beets in boxes of damp sand so they wouldn't shrivel, hung her cabbages by the roots, spread her potatoes in a single layer so one rotten spud couldn't spoil the pile, and kept the apples far away from everything else because they gave off a gas that made vegetables sprout. A well-packed cellar held a family's harvest from October to April. The whole thing cost the labor of digging. When the grid failed, the root cellar never noticed because it had never been plugged in to begin with. Number 21, the pot-in-pot cooler. In the hot, dry parts of the country, families kept butter and greens fresh without ice, using nothing but 2 clay pots and a handful of sand. Your great-grandmother nested a small pot inside a larger one, filled the gap between them with wet sand, and covered the top with a damp cloth. As the water evaporated in the dry air, it pulled heat out of the inner pot, dropping the temperature inside by 15 or 20 degrees. Butter that would have turned rancid on the counter stayed firm for days. The science is the same reason sweat cools your skin. The whole setup cost a few cents and a bucket of water. Modern coolers run on batteries and compressors. This one ran on physics and a hot afternoon. Number 20. The springhouse crock. If a family was lucky enough to have a cold spring or creek running through their property, they built a small stone house right over the water and turned running water into a refrigerator. Milk, cream, and butter went into sealed crocks set down in the flowing stream, where the constant cold current kept them at cellar temperature, even in July. Some families just weighted a crock down in the creek with a rock. The moving water carried heat away far faster than still water ever could. A crock cost a dime and lasted a lifetime. This is why so many old farmhouses sit beside a stream. When the power lines finally came, the spring house fell silent, but for 100 years, it kept the cream sweet without a single watt. Number 19. Clabbered milk and farmer's cheese. When milk soured before it could be drunk, nobody poured it out. They let it turn into supper. Raw milk left in a warm crock, naturally clabbered, thickening into something like tangy yogurt as wild bacteria did their work. Your great-grandmother ate it with a sprinkle of sugar, or she poured it into a cloth, hung it from a nail to drip overnight, and by morning had a soft farmer's cheese. Nothing was wasted, and the family got protein that would otherwise have gone down the drain. A gallon of milk was too precious to lose. Today we panic and throw out milk the second it smells off, forgetting that our great-grandparents saw sour milk not as garbage, but as the beginning of the next meal. Number 18. Sun-dried jerky. Long before the freezer, the sun was the meat preservative. Your great-grandmother sliced lean beef or venison paper-thin against the grain, rubbed it hard with salt and pepper, and hung the strips on lines under a hot sun with a cloth draped over to keep the flies off. In 2 or 3 dry days, the moisture was gone, and with it any home for the bacteria that spoil meat. What was left was jerky that kept for months in a sack in the pantry, needing no cold at all. Salt cost pennies, the sun cost nothing. Hunters and pioneers lived on it for weeks in the saddle. Store-bought jerky today is soft and full of preservatives. The old sun-dried version was hard as leather and would outlast a blackout by half a year. Number 17. The pickling crock. Every fall, the big stoneware crock came up from the cellar, and cabbage, cucumbers, and green beans went into it to be transformed by salt and thyme. This is where things get clever. Your great-grandmother packed shredded cabbage with salt, weighted it down under a plate, and let it sit. The salt pulled out the water, and in that brine, wild bacteria fermented the vegetables into sauerkraut, producing acid that preserved the whole batch for the entire winter. This wasn't just about flavor. That fermented cabbage was loaded with vitamin C, and it kept sailors and farm families from getting scurvy when nothing fresh grew for months. A crock and a bag of salt cost almost nothing. The vegetables preserved themselves. No canning, no cold, no power. Just salt, patience, and biology doing the work. Number 16. The sourdough starter. First pattern break. Here's where it gets interesting. When you can't run to the store for a packet of yeast, and there is no store, you capture yeast from the air itself. Your great-grandmother kept a crock of flour and water alive on the back of the stove, feeding it a little fresh flour every day. Wild yeasts and bacteria, living naturally on the grain and floating in the kitchen air, colonized that mixture and made it bubble and rise. That single crock leavened every loaf, every biscuit, every flapjack the family ate, and a healthy starter could live for decades, passed from mother to daughter. Prospectors guarded their starters so fiercely they slept with them to keep them from freezing, which is exactly why old-timers were called sourdoughs. No refrigeration, no yeast packets, no grid, just a living culture on the stove that never quit. Number 15. Water bath canning. When the garden came in all at once in August, canning let a family lock summer in a jar and eat it in February. Your great-grandmother packed tomatoes, beans, and peaches into glass mason jars, sealed them with a rubber ring and a metal lid, and boiled them in a big kettle of water for an hour. The heat killed everything living inside, and the cooling seal pulled the lid down tight, creating a vacuum that no air and no spoilage could break. A properly sealed jar sat on the pantry shelf for a year or more, with no cold whatsoever. A case of jars was an investment, but the lids cost pennies and got reused. Row upon row of glowing red and gold jars in the cellar was a family's insurance against a hungry winter, completely independent of any power line. Number 14. Water glass eggs. Here is the trick I promised you. Hens lay heavily in spring and summer, then nearly stop in the cold months, so families found a way to save the surplus for when the grid and the hens went quiet. Your great-grandmother lowered clean, unwashed eggs into a crock filled with a solution of water glass, which is sodium silicate, or sometimes a slaked lime and water mix. The liquid sealed the porous shell completely, blocking out air and bacteria, and the eggs stayed good to eat for 8 or 9 months at room temperature. Farm journals of the era swore by it. A crock of water glass eggs meant cake and cornbread all winter long. No fridge in sight. Modern egg cartons in a cold refrigerator barely last a month. 100 years ago, a crock in the pantry beat that 4 times over. Number 13. Cornmeal mush, stretched 3 ways. Cornmeal was the cheapest food in America, and a smart cook turned 1 pot of it into 3 different meals. In the morning, your great-grandmother boiled cornmeal into a thick porridge and served it hot with a little molasses. Whatever was left got poured into a loaf pan and set in the cool cellar overnight, where it firmed up solid as a brick. The next day, she sliced that firm mush, fried it crisp in bacon grease, and served it golden for breakfast or dinner. 1 nickel bag of cornmeal fed a family for days across half a dozen meals. There was no waste and no need for anything cold or electric. When the money ran out and the lights went dark, cornmeal mush was the wall that stood between a family and an empty stomach. Number 12. The buried Dutch oven. Second pattern break. Before ovens ran on gas or electricity, the oven was a cast iron pot you buried in fire. Your great-grandmother would build up a bed of hardwood coals, set the heavy Dutch oven right in them, shovel more glowing coals onto the flat lid, and bake bread, beans, or a whole cobbler in the ground. The trick was the ratio, more coals on top than underneath, so the food browned evenly without scorching. That thick iron held heat so steadily it baked as true as any modern oven. And here's the wild part. The lid was designed with a rim to hold coals, turning a single pot into a complete oven with no walls and no power. A good Dutch oven cost a few dollars and got handed down for generations. When the grid fails, this is the appliance that still works. Number 11. Braided onions and garlic. The pantry had no crisper drawer, so families preserved their alliums by hanging them in the air. Your great-grandmother braided the dried green tops of onions and garlic together into long ropes and hung them from the kitchen rafters. Up in the moving air, away from any moisture, the bulbs cured and stayed firm and sweet for 6 or 8 months. Hanging them meant air circulated on every side, so nothing sat in a damp spot and rotted. Onions and garlic were the backbone of flavor in a poor kitchen, the thing that made a pot of plain beans taste like something. A braid cost only the harvest and a few minutes of weaving. Long after the power might fail, those ropes hung waiting in the rafters, ready to season whatever the family could scrape together. Number 10. Baking soda for beans. Dried beans were the poor family's meat, but they could take 3 or 4 hours to soften, and that meant burning through precious firewood. Your great-grandmother's shortcut was a 1/4 teaspoon of baking soda dropped in the pot. The soda made the water alkaline, which broke down the tough skins and softened the beans in nearly half the time, saving fuel a family could not spare. It also cut down on the compounds that made beans hard to digest. But you had to be careful, because too much soda turned the beans to soft mush with a soapy taste. A whole box of baking soda cost a nickel and lasted the year. This was the kind of quiet chemistry a good cook knew by heart, saving both time and firewood without ever knowing the science behind it. Number 9. Buttermilk biscuits. No yeast required. When there was no yeast and no time to wait for dough to rise, bread still made it to the table in 20 minutes flat. Your great-grandmother cut cold lard into flour, salt, and baking soda, then poured in sour buttermilk and stirred just until it came together. Here's the chemistry. The acid in the buttermilk hit the baking soda and released carbon dioxide bubbles instantly, lifting the biscuits high in the heat with no yeast and no rising time at all. She rolled them out, cut them with the rim of a glass, and had hot bread on the table before the beans finished. A pan of biscuits cost almost nothing. This is how families ate fresh bread every single day, even with no yeast in the house and no clock to wait on. Number 8. Beans and cornbread together. Third pattern break. Controversy incoming because for years, modern nutritionists looked down on this meal as poor people's food, but your great-grandparents were quietly outsmarting them. Beans on their own are missing a couple of the building blocks your body needs, and so is corn. But here's what the old cooks knew by instinct. Put them together on the same plate and each one supplies exactly what the other lacks, forming a complete protein as good as a steak. Beans and cornbread wasn't just cheap and filling, it was nutritionally brilliant, and it kept whole families strong through years when meat almost never appeared. A pot of beans and a pan of cornbread cost a few cents and fed 6. Scientists only confirmed the protein pairing decades later. The families eating it every night in 1932 didn't need a study, they just knew it worked. Number 7. Potato water bread. Nothing left the kitchen unused, not even the cloudy water the potatoes boiled in. Your great-grandmother saved that starchy water and used it instead of plain water to mix her bread dough. The starch fed the yeast and held moisture in the loaf, so the bread rose higher, stayed soft for days longer, and had a tender crumb that plain water bread never got. It also carried a little of the potato's nutrition into the loaf. Not a drop was wasted, and the bread was flat out better for it. This is the kind of resourcefulness that defined a poor kitchen, where the byproduct of one meal quietly improved the next. We pour that water down the drain now without a thought, never realizing our great-grandmothers were using it to make better bread for free. Number 6. Potting meat in lard. Long before refrigeration, cooks preserved cooked meat by sealing it away from air under a layer of fat. Your great-grandmother would cook down pork or chicken until it was falling apart, pack it tight into a crock, and pour melted lard over the top until it was completely submerged. As the lard cooled, it hardened into an airtight seal that locked bacteria out, and the meat underneath kept for weeks in a cool cellar with no cold at all. Spread on bread, it made a rich meal out of scraps. The French call this confit and charge a fortune for it in restaurants. Your great-grandmother called it Tuesday. A crock of potted meat under lard was meat you could count on long after the animal was gone. and long after the power might fail. Number 5. The reflector oven. Fourth pattern break. When a family cooked over an open hearth with no oven at all, they baked bread using nothing but tin and firelight. The reflector oven was a simple angled box of shiny tin, open on the fireside, that stood in front of the flames. Its polished walls caught the heat and radiation from the fire and bounced it back onto the food from every direction at once, baking biscuits and cakes as evenly as a real oven. Your great-grandmother just turned the shelf now and then for an even brown. A tin reflector cost $1 and folded flat for storage. It needed no fuel of its own beyond the fire, already burning for warmth. This is how pioneers and hearth cooks baked fresh bread with no stove, no gas, and no grid, just a sheet of tin and a good fire. Number 4. Molasses, the poor man's sugar. When white sugar was too dear, molasses was the sweetener, the energy, and the medicine of the poor American kitchen. It cost a fraction of the price of refined sugar because it was the thick syrup left behind when sugar was made, and a single jug went a long way. Your great-grandmother stirred it into cornmeal mush, poured it over biscuits, baked it into gingerbread and shoofly pie, and sweetened the children's morning oats with it. Unlike white sugar, molasses carried real iron and minerals, so it did more than sweeten. It actually nourished. It also kept baked goods moist for days. A jug cost pennies and never spoiled sitting in the pantry. When the Depression stripped kitchens bare, molasses was the small daily sweetness that reminded a struggling family that life still held something good. Number 3. Lye hominy from wood ash. Here is the trick I promised you, the one your modern kitchen cannot duplicate. Plain dried corn is tough, hard to cook, and missing a vitamin so important that people who ate only corn developed a deadly disease. Your great-grandmother fixed all of it with wood ash. She soaked dried corn kernels in water mixed with ash from the stove, which created a strong alkaline solution called LYE. Here is the chemistry. That alkaline bath dissolved the tough hulls, swelled the kernels into plump hominy, and unlocked the niacin trapped inside the corn so the body could finally absorb it. This single step is why corn-eating families did not waste away from that disease. Native peoples discovered it thousands of years ago, and poor families kept doing it by the fire. No factory, no supplement, no grid, just corn, ash, and a reaction that fed a continent. Number 2. Bread-stretched meat. When a family had half a pound of ground meat and 6 mouths to feed, the secret to a full meal wasn't more meat, it was stale bread. Before mixing anything, your great-grandmother tore old bread into a bowl and soaked it in milk until it turned to mush. Then worked that soggy paste into the ground meat with an egg and an onion. Here's why it worked. The milk-soaked bread trapped moisture throughout the meat, and the starch held it there as it cooked, so the loaf stayed juicy and every slice held together instead of crumbling dry. One skillet of meat suddenly fed the whole table. Fancy chefs call this a panade now and treat it like a French secret. Your great-grandmother called it making do. It stretched the smallest amount of meat into a meal nobody left hungry from. Number 1. The perpetual soup pot. And at the top of the list, the single trick that outlasted every blackout, every hard winter, and every empty wallet, the pot that never emptied. On the back of the stove sat a heavy kettle that simmered day after day, and into it went everything. The ham bone from Sunday, the carrot tops, the outer cabbage leaves, the last spoonful of beans, the water the potatoes boiled in. Nothing was ever thrown away. It all went into the pot to deepen the broth. Each morning, your great-grandmother ladled out breakfast and added whatever the day brought, so the soup was never the same twice and never ran dry. A single ham bone flavored a week of meals. This was the beating heart of the poor kitchen, a pot that turned scraps into supper endlessly, asking for nothing but a low fire and a cook who refused to waste a single thing. Here's my challenge to you. Pick one of these and try it this week. Start the bacon grease can. Braid your onions. Keep a sourdough starter alive on the counter and bake with it. Then come back and tell me in the comments if your great-grandmother was just getting by, or if she actually knew something we've forgotten. Because these weren't just tricks. They were the reason families survived when the grid went dark, and they'll still work the next time it does. Your great-grandmother knew. Now you know too.